Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today we're going back to the year 1859, to the story of a black girl with extraordinary strength. A girl whose life was far darker than anyone ever imagined. What people witnessed shocked the community, but the truth behind her strength remained hidden, whispered about, and never written down the way it should have been. This is a difficult and intense story. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. On the afternoon of September 8, 1859, a 17-year-old enslaved girl named Essie lifted a 400-live wagon off a trapped horse, using only her bare hands. She did it in front of 12 white witnesses. And from that moment forward, her life became a nightmare darker than anything she could have imagined, because in the slave-holding South, a black girl with superhuman strength was not a miracle. She was merchandise. This is the story of Essie. The girl they tried to break. The girl they tried to study. The girl they tried to turn into a specimen for their twisted experiments. And the girl who would eventually bring them all to ruin in ways they never saw coming. To understand what happened to Essie, you first need to understand the world that created her. And that world was built on the bones of people who looked just like her. The Harrington farm sat on 600 acres of low country South Carolina, about 30 miles inland from Charleston. It was not one of the grand plantations that would later become symbols of the Old South. It was a working farm, modest by the standards of the time, owned by a family that had been in the region for 3 generations. The Harringtons grew cotton and rice, kept livestock, and owned 47 enslaved people who did all the actual work. Essie was born on this farm on February 14, 1842. Her mother, a woman named Cora, died giving birth to her. The labor was long and brutal, and the midwife who attended, an enslaved woman named Aunt Bess, did everything she could to save both mother and child. In the end, she could only save one. Essie never knew her mother. She only knew the stories that others told about her. That Cora had been beautiful and strong. That she had a singing voice that could make grown men weep. That she had loved the man who fathered Essie with a fierce and forbidden love. That man was named Solomon. He was sold to a plantation in Georgia when Essie was 3 years old. One day he was there, holding her in his arms and calling her his little princess. The next day he was gone, loaded onto a wagon with 5 other enslaved people and taken away forever. Essie screamed for him until her voice gave out. She could not understand. She could not understand. She was 3 years old, and her father had been ripped from her life like a page torn from a book. She never saw him again. Essie was raised by the community of enslaved people on the Harrington farm. They took turns caring for her, feeding her, teaching her the rules of survival in a world designed to destroy people like them. Aunt Bess, the midwife who had delivered her, became something like a grandmother to her. An older man named Uncle Peter, who worked in the stables, taught her about horses and animals. A young woman named Ruby, only a few years older than Essie herself, became her closest friend and confidant. They noticed something different about Essie almost immediately. When she was 5 years old, she carried a full bucket of water from the well to the main house without stopping to rest. The bucket weighed nearly 40 pounds. Grown men struggled with those buckets. Essie carried it like it was nothing. When she was 8, she helped push a stuck wagon out of the mud during a rainstorm. 4 men had been straining against it, their feet slipping in the mire, making no progress. Essie put her small hands on the back of the wagon and pushed, and the wagon moved. When she was 12, A spooked horse kicked her in the chest so hard that she flew backward 10 feet and landed in a pile of hay. Anyone else would have had broken ribs, punctured lungs, internal bleeding. Essie stood up, brushed herself off, and calmed the horse with gentle words and steady hands. She was not even bruised. The enslaved people on the Harrington farm recognized what they were seeing. They had heard stories passed down through generations about people born with gifts that could not be explained. People who could see the future. People who could heal the sick with a touch. People who possessed strength beyond what any normal body should contain. These gifts were dangerous in the world of slavery. They drew attention. They inspired fear, and fear in the hands of white people always led to violence. So they hid Essie's gift. They taught her to conceal it. They told her never to lift more than a normal girl could lift. Never to push harder than a normal girl could push. Never to let anyone see what she could really do. You keep it secret. Aunt Bess told her over and over again. You hear me, child. What you got inside you? It's a blessing and a curse. The Lord gave it to you for a reason, but the white folks won't see it that way. They'll see you as something to be used, something to be studied, something to be afraid of. And when white folks get afraid of us, they kill us. Essie listened. She learned. She became an expert at appearing ordinary, at holding back, at being invisible. She worked in the fields like everyone else, picking cotton until her fingers bled, bent over the rows from sunrise to sunset. She worked in the main house sometimes, cleaning and cooking and serving meals to the Harrington family. She kept her eyes down and her mouth shut and her strength hidden. For 12 years, this strategy worked. For 12 years, Essie survived by being unremarkable. For 12 years, no one outside the enslaved community knew what she was capable of. And then came September 8th, 1859. It was a Thursday, hot and humid, the kind of late summer day that made the air feel like wet cotton against your skin. Essie was working in the fields that morning along with about 30 other enslaved people. They were harvesting the last of the summer cotton, moving down the rows with practiced efficiency, filling their bags with the white bolls that would be processed and sold and shipped to textile mills in England and New England. Around midday, a commotion broke out near the main road. A wagon had overturned in a ditch, its front axle cracked, its cargo of supplies scattered across the muddy ground. The horse that had been pulling the wagon was trapped beneath it, thrashing and screaming, its rear legs tangled in the traces. A group of white men had gathered around the accident, including Mr. William Harrington himself, the owner of the farm. They were trying to figure out how to lift the wagon without hurting the horse further. The animal was valuable, worth at least $200, and Harrington did not want to lose it. We need more men, one of the white men said. This thing's too heavy. We'll have to send for help from town. That horse will be dead before help arrives. Another man replied, Look at it. It's panicking. It's going to break its own legs if we don't get it out soon. Essie was watching from the edge of the field, along with several other enslaved workers. They had stopped their picking to see what was happening. No one expected them to help. No one asked for their assistance. They were property, after all, not participants in the decisions of white men. But Essie could hear the horse screaming. She could see its wild eyes, its flailing hooves, its desperate attempts to free itself. She had grown up around horses. Uncle Peter had taught her to love them, to understand them, to feel their pain as if it were her own, and she knew with absolute certainty that the horse would die if she did not act. For a moment, she hesitated. 12 years of careful concealment. 12 years of hiding what she could do. Aunt Bess's voice in her head, warning her about what would happen if the white folks found out. But the horse was dying. Right there in front of her eyes, the horse was dying. Essie made her choice. She walked forward, past the other enslaved workers, past the white men arguing about what to do. She walked straight up to the overturned wagon, planted her feet in the mud, and bent down to grip the wooden frame. "What the hell are you doing, girl?" One of the white men shouted. "Get away from there." Essie did not respond. She took a deep breath, tightened her grip, and lifted. The wagon rose. 400 pounds of wood and iron and scattered cargo rose off the ground, lifted by the arms of a 17-year-old girl who weighed barely 120 pounds herself. She held it there, steady and sure, while the horse scrambled free from the traces and staggered to its feet. Then she set the wagon down gently and stepped back. The silence that followed was absolute. 12 white men stood frozen, staring at Essie with expressions that ranged from disbelief to awe to something darker. Something that looked like calculation. William Harrington was the first to speak. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Essie looked at the ground. "I don't know, sir. I just did." Harrington walked toward her slowly, like a man approaching a wild animal. He circled her, examining her from every angle, his eyes narrow and thoughtful. "How much can you lift?" he asked. "I don't know, sir." "Show me?" And just like that, 12 years of hiding came to an end. In the hours that followed, William Harrington subjected Essie to a series of tests. He had her lift barrels of water, sacks of grain, pieces of farm equipment. He had her pull a loaded wagon by herself. He had her arm wrestle the strongest man on the farm, a field hand named Big Marcus, who weighed over 250 pounds. Essie won every time. She lifted everything Harrington put in front of her. She pulled the wagon without breaking a sweat. She pinned Big Marcus's arm to the table in less than 3 seconds. The white men watching began to murmur among themselves. Essie could hear fragments of their conversations. Words like freak and demon and unnatural, but there were other words, too. Words like valuable and profitable and opportunity. That night, locked in her cabin, Essie finally allowed herself to cry. Ruby held her while she sobbed, stroking her hair and whispering words of comfort that they both knew were lies. "Maybe it'll be all right," Ruby said. "Maybe they'll just put you to harder work. Maybe that's all." But they both knew it would not be all right. They both knew that something had changed. Something fundamental, something irreversible. Essie had revealed herself, and now she would pay the price. The price came 3 weeks later, on October 1st, 1859. A carriage arrived at the Harrington farm carrying a well-dressed white man in his 50s. He had silver hair, pale gray eyes, and the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor in his life. His name was Dr. Silas Whitmore, and he was a physician from Charleston. But Whitmore was not just any physician. He was a man with a particular obsession, a man who had dedicated his career to what he called the science of racial difference. A man who believed with the fervor of religious conviction that black people were biologically inferior to white people, and who spent his life trying to prove this belief through research, experimentation, and the systematic torture of enslaved bodies. Whitmore had heard about Essie through the network of gossip that connected the planter class throughout the South. A black girl with superhuman strength, an anomaly, a specimen that demanded investigation. He had come to buy her. William Harrington received Whitmore in the parlor of the main house. They drank whiskey and talked business while Essie waited outside, guarded by 2 overseers who had been told not to let her out of their sight. "I'll give you $2,000 for her," Whitmore said. Sash today. Harrington nearly choked on his drink. $2,000 was an extraordinary sum. 4 times what a healthy adult field hand would fetch at auction. It was more than Harrington had made in profit the entire previous year. That's a generous offer, Harrington said carefully. But I have to ask, why is she worth that much to you? Whitmore smiled. And there was something cold in that smile. Something reptilian. I'm a man of science, Mr. Harrington. I've spent my career studying the physiological differences between the races. This girl represents something I've never encountered before. A deviation from the norm. An exception that might prove the rule. I intend to study her thoroughly. Study her how? That's not your concern, Mr. Harrington. Your concern is whether you want $2,000 in your pocket by sundown. I suggest you take the money. Harrington took the money. Essie was loaded into Whitmore's carriage that same afternoon. She was not given time to say goodbye to anyone. She was not given time to gather her few possessions. She was simply taken, like a piece of furniture being moved from one house to another. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Essie looked back and saw the enslaved people of Harrington Farm gathered at the edge of the road. Aunt Bess was there, her weathered face streaming with tears. Uncle Peter was there, his jaw set with helpless rage. Ruby was there, one hand raised in farewell, her mouth moving with words that Essie could not hear. Essie turned away. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply sat in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Whatever was coming, she would face it. She had no other choice. The journey to Charleston took 2 days. Whitmore did not speak to Essie during that time. He sat across from her in the carriage, reading medical journals and making notes in a leather-bound notebook. Occasionally, he would look up at her, study her with those cold gray eyes, and then return to his reading. He treated her like a specimen already, an object to be examined rather than a person to be acknowledged. They arrived in Charleston on the evening of October 3, 1859. The city was the largest and wealthiest in South Carolina, a hub of cotton trade and slave commerce. Its streets were lined with elegant townhouses, its harbor crowded with ships from around the world. It was a monument to the prosperity that slavery had built, a glittering facade over a foundation of human suffering. Whitmore's residence was a large brick mansion on Meeting Street, one of the most prestigious addresses in the city. From the outside, it looked like the home of any wealthy Charleston gentleman. Inside, it was something else entirely. Whitmore led Essie through the front door and down a long hallway, past parlors and dining rooms and libraries filled with books. They descended a flight of stairs into the basement, then another flight into a sub-basement that Essie had not known existed. The air grew colder as they went deeper. The walls changed from plastered brick to bare stone. Finally, they arrived at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Whitmore produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it. "This will be your home for the foreseeable future," he said, pushing the door open. "I hope you'll find it comfortable." The room beyond was a nightmare. It was large, perhaps 30 by 40 feet, with a high ceiling and no windows. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved organs, surgical instruments, leather restraints, and devices whose purposes Essie could not identify. In the center of the room was a large wooden table fitted with iron shackles. Along one wall was a row of iron cages, each large enough to hold a human being. The smell hit her like a physical blow. Blood and antiseptic and something else. Something rotten. Something dead. "I've been doing this work for 20 years," Whitmore said, walking into the room with the casual air of a man showing off his workshop. "I've examined hundreds of specimens, but I've never encountered anything like you. A Negro with strength far beyond what the race should be capable of. It defies everything I thought I knew." He turned to look at her, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that made Essie's skin crawl. "I'm going to find out why. I'm going to discover the source of your strength. And when I do, I'll publish my findings in the most prestigious medical journals in the world. This will be my legacy. This will be what I'm remembered for." Essie said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was in the hands of a monster, and no words would change that. "Put her in the third cage," Whitmore said to someone behind her. Essie had not realized there was anyone else in the room. She turned and saw two large white men standing by the door. They were not dressed like gentlemen. They were dressed like laborers, with thick arms and cruel faces. They moved toward her without hesitation. Essie could have fought them. She could have broken their bones like twigs, but she did not. Not yet. She needed to understand this place. She needed to learn its secrets. She needed to wait for the right moment. So she let them lead her to the cage. She let them lock her inside. She sat down on the cold stone floor and watched as Whitmore and his men left the room, the heavy door swinging shut behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place. She was alone in the darkness, alone with the jars of organs and the surgical instruments and the smell of death. But she was not broken. Not yet. Not ever. Essie made herself a promise in that moment. A promise that she would survive whatever was coming. A promise that she would find a way out of this place. A promise that she would make every single person responsible for her suffering pay for what they had done. She did not know how she would keep this promise. She did not know when or where or with what weapons. But she knew that she would keep it. She had always been strong. Now she would find out just how strong. The experiments began the next morning. Whitmore arrived with his assistants at sunrise. They opened Essie's cage and brought her to the table in the center of the room. They strapped her down with leather restraints reinforced with iron chains. They pulled up her shirt and examined her torso with cold hands and clinical detachment. "We'll start with measurements," Whitmore said, producing a set of calipers from his coat. "I want exact dimensions of every bone, every muscle, every organ we can access without surgery." For the next 4 hours, they measured her. The length of her arms, the circumference of her thighs, the width of her shoulders, the depth of her chest. They squeezed her muscles and noted their density. They tested her reflexes with small hammers. They drew blood from her arm and examined it under a microscope. Through it all, Essie remained silent. She did not resist. She did not cry. She simply lay there and let them do what they wanted, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind far away. When the measurements were complete, Whitmore moved on to what he called strength assessments. They released her from the table and brought her to a corner of the room where a series of weights had been arranged. Iron blocks of increasing size, ranging from 10 pounds to 500 pounds. "Lift each one," Whitmore ordered, starting with the lightest. Essie lifted them. One by one, she lifted every weight in the row. When she reached the 500-pound block, she lifted it too, holding it above her head for a count of 10 before setting it back down. Whitmore's eyes were wide with excitement. "Remarkable," he breathed. "Absolutely remarkable. We'll need to find heavier weights. We need to find your limit." They never found it. Over the days and weeks that followed, Whitmore subjected Essie to every test he could devise. He had her lift increasingly heavy objects. He had her pull against restraints to measure the force she could exert. He had her run on a treadmill until she should have collapsed from exhaustion. Except she never did. He brought in other physicians, colleagues who shared his interest in racial science, and had her perform for them like a circus animal. And then there were the other experiments, the ones that drew blood. Whitmore was not content to measure Essie's strength from the outside. He wanted to understand its source. He wanted to see what was different about her on the inside. So he cut her open. The first surgery was on October 15, 1859. Whitmore made an incision in her left arm, parting the skin and muscle to expose the tissue beneath. He examined it with his magnifying glass, took samples, made detailed drawings in his notebook. Then he sewed her back up and watched her heal. She healed faster than any patient he had ever seen. The wound that should have taken weeks to close was fully healed in 4 days. This only increased his obsession. More surgeries followed. Her right arm, her left thigh, her back. Each time Whitmore cut deeper, took more samples, pushed the boundaries of what her body could endure. And each time Essie survived. She healed. She grew stronger, not weaker. But the physical pain was not the worst part. The worst part was the humiliation, the dehumanization. Being treated like an object, a thing, a specimen to be studied and cataloged and discussed in clinical terms that stripped away every trace of her humanity. Whitmore held exhibitions. He invited other physicians, professors, wealthy planters who fancied themselves amateur scientists. They came to his basement laboratory, paid handsome fees for the privilege, and watched as Essie was forced to perform feats of strength, as Whitmore lectured about her anomalous physiology, as they debated whether her abilities were evidence of some primitive throwback or a mutation that might be bred into future generations of slaves. They spoke about her as if she were not there, as if she could not hear them, as if she did not matter. But Essie was there. She could hear them. And she remembered every single word. She remembered the name of Dr. Theodore Simmons, a professor from the Medical College of South Carolina, who suggested that Essie should be bred with the strongest male slaves to see if her abilities could be inherited. She remembered the name of James Crawford, a cotton planter from Beaufort, who offered to buy Essie for $5,000 so he could use her as a work animal on his plantation. She remembered the name of Senator Robert Tillman, a state legislator who attended one of Whitmore's exhibitions and later wrote a letter praising the important scientific work being done in that basement. She remembered all of their names, all of their faces, all of their words. She filed them away in her memory, building a catalog of every person who had participated in her torment, who had profited from her suffering, who had treated her as something less than human. Someday she would use that catalog. Someday she would make them all pay. But that day was not yet here. For now, she had to survive. And survival meant more than just enduring the physical abuse. It meant keeping her mind intact. It meant finding something to hold on to when everything else was being stripped away. Essie found 2 things that kept her sane during those dark months. The first was her memory of the people who had loved her. Aunt Bess, Uncle Peter, Ruby, her mother, who she had never known, but who lived in the stories others had told about her. Her father, who had called her his little princess before he was taken away. These memories were her anchor. They reminded her that she was a person, not a specimen. That she had been loved, even if she was now alone. The second thing was her growing understanding of Whitmore and his world. Essie was not educated in the traditional sense. She could not read or write. She had never been to school or studied books, or learned the things that white children learned in their classrooms. But she was intelligent, deeply intelligent, with a quick mind and a sharp memory. And she was observant. In the month she spent in Whitmore's basement, she learned more about her captor than he ever learned about her. She learned that Whitmore was not as respected as he pretended to be. The mainstream medical establishment in Charleston viewed him as a fringe figure, a crank whose obsession with racial science had led him away from legitimate practice. His exhibitions were attended by fellow travelers and curiosity seekers, not by the leading physicians of the city. She learned that Whitmore was in financial trouble. His experiments were expensive, and his practice brought in less and less money each year. He had borrowed heavily to maintain his lifestyle and his laboratory. He was desperate for a breakthrough that would restore his reputation and refill his coffers. She learned that Whitmore was involved in activities that went far beyond medical research. Late at night, when he thought Issy was asleep in her cage, she heard him meeting with men who came to his basement through a secret entrance. They spoke in hushed voices about shipments and routes and prices per head. They discussed the names of other traders, the locations of holding pens, the bribes that had been paid to customs officials and harbor masters. Whitmore was a slave trader, not just a buyer and seller of human beings, which was legal throughout the South, but something more. He was involved in the illegal importation of enslaved Africans, a practice that had been banned by federal law since 1808, but continued in secret, bringing thousands of people from Africa to American shores each year. This was a hanging offense. If Whitmore were caught, he would be tried and executed. And yet he continued, driven by greed and the certainty that he was above the law. Issy listened to these conversations and remembered everything. She memorized names, dates, locations, the details of transactions that implicated some of the most powerful men in South Carolina. She did not know how she would use this information, but she knew it was valuable. She knew it was a weapon. And she was building an arsenal. The months passed. October became November, became December. The year 1859 gave way to 1860. Issy marked the time by the rhythm of Whitmore's experiments, by the cycles of pain and recovery that defined her existence. But things were changing outside the walls of her prison. Things that would eventually change everything. In November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. The news reached Charleston like a thunderclap. Lincoln was a Republican, a member of the party that opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. To the slaveholding South, his election was an existential threat. Within weeks, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. On December 20, 1860, the state legislature voted unanimously to leave the United States and form an independent republic. Other southern states quickly followed. By February of 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. War was coming. Everyone knew it. The question was not whether it would happen, but when and how. For Essie, these political developments were distant thunder, barely audible through the thick walls of her underground prison. But she could sense the change in Whitmore's behavior. He was anxious, distracted, spending less time on his experiments and more time on his illegal trading activities. The impending war was disrupting his business. Supply lines were uncertain. Prices were volatile. The future was unclear, and when the future is unclear, men make mistakes. On March 15, 1861, Whitmore made his mistake. He had been drinking that night, which was unusual for him. Whitmore was typically a controlled man, precise in his habits, disciplined in his vices. But the stress of recent months had worn him down. He came to the basement laboratory with a bottle of bourbon and a stack of papers, muttering to himself about debts and deadlines and deals gone wrong. Essie watched from her cage as he sat at his desk and spread the papers before him. They were financial records, shipping manifests, letters from his partners in the slave trade. He studied them, made notes, cursed under his breath. And then he fell asleep. It happened gradually. His head nodded forward. His pen slipped from his fingers. His breathing deepened into the slow rhythm of unconsciousness. The bourbon had done its work. Essie waited. She counted to 100, then to 200, then to 300. Whitmore did not stir. This was her chance. She had been testing the bars of her cage for months, pressing against them with gradually increasing force, careful never to bend them enough to be noticed. She knew exactly how much pressure they could withstand. She knew exactly how much force she needed to break them. She pressed. The iron groaned. She pressed harder. The metal began to bend. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent basement. Essie froze, her eyes fixed on Whitmore's sleeping form. He shifted slightly, mumbled something unintelligible, and then settled back into sleep. She continued. Bar by bar, she bent the iron wide enough to slip through. It took her nearly an hour, moving in agonizing increments, stopping every time Whitmore showed any sign of waking. Finally, the gap was wide enough. Essie squeezed through, her body scraping against the bent metal, and stepped onto the cold stone floor of the laboratory. She was out of the cage, but she was not free yet. Essie moved silently across the room, her bare feet making no sound on the stone. She approached Whitmore's desk and looked down at the papers spread before him. She could not read them. The letters and numbers meant nothing to her, but she had spent months listening to Whitmore discuss these documents with his partners. She had memorized the shapes of certain words, the formats of certain papers. She knew which ones were important. She gathered them all. Every paper on the desk. Every document in the drawers. She found a leather satchel in the corner of the room and stuffed everything inside. Then she looked at Whitmore, asleep and helpless before her. She could kill him. It would be easy. A single blow to the head, delivered with the strength that made her so valuable to him. He would never wake up. He would never hurt anyone again. But killing him would not be enough. Death was too simple, too clean, too final. Whitmore deserved worse than death. He deserved to see everything he had built collapse around him. He deserved to watch as the people he had hurt rose up to destroy him. Essie found a knife on a nearby table. One of the surgical instruments that had been used to cut into her flesh so many times. She picked it up and walked back to where Whitmore sat slumped in his chair. She did not kill him. Instead, she made a small cut on the back of his hand, just deep enough to draw blood. With that blood, she wrote a message on the wall above his desk. The words were crude, barely legible. She had never written before, but she had watched Whitmore write, and she had memorized the shapes of certain letters, certain words. It took her a long time, working carefully, forming each letter with painstaking effort. When she was finished, she stepped back and looked at her work. The message read, "You measured me. Now I have the measure of you." It was not elegant. It was not eloquent. But it was enough. Essie took the satchel full of documents and left the laboratory. She climbed the stairs to the main level of the house, moving silently through the darkened hallways. She found a back door that led to the garden and slipped outside into the cool March night. For the first time in almost 18 months, she was free. But she was not safe. She was a fugitive now, a runaway slave in the heart of the Confederacy. If she were caught, she would be returned to Whitmore, and the punishment she would face would be beyond anything she had experienced before. She needed to disappear. She needed to become invisible. She needed to find allies who could help her survive and plan her next move. As she made her way through the streets of Charleston, staying in the shadows, avoiding the gas lamps that illuminated the main thoroughfares. She knew where she needed to go. She had heard Whitmore's assistants talk about a part of the city where free blacks lived, where runaways sometimes found shelter, where the authorities did not look too closely. She found it as dawn was breaking. A neighborhood of small wooden houses and narrow streets, tucked away in a corner of the city that the wealthy white residents preferred to ignore. She knocked on doors until she found someone willing to listen to her story. Her name was Mrs. Harriet Cole. She was a free black woman in her 60s who made her living as a seamstress, and her mission helping enslaved people escape to freedom. She listened to Essie's story with wide eyes and a steady heart. "You escaped from Whitmore," Mrs. Cole said when Essie had finished. "Lord have mercy. I've heard stories about that man. Terrible stories. You're lucky to be alive, child." "I'm not lucky," Essie said. "I'm strong. And I'm not done yet." She opened the satchel and showed Mrs. Cole the documents she had taken. "I don't know what all these papers say," Essie admitted, "but I know they're important. I heard Whitmore talking about them. Names of people who buy and sell slaves illegally. Dates and places of shipments from Africa. Evidence that could send men to the gallows." Mrs. Cole looked at the papers with growing astonishment. "Child, do you know what you have here? This could bring down some of the most powerful men in South Carolina." "I know," Essie said. "That's what I want." Mrs. Cole was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, I know people who can help. People in the North who can make sure these papers get into the right hands. But it's going to take time. And you're going to need to stay hidden. Whitmore will be looking for you. Every slave catcher in the state will be looking for you." "I can stay hidden," Essie said. "I've been hiding my whole life." And so began the next phase of Essie's journey. She stayed with Mrs. Cole for several weeks, learning to read with painstaking effort, studying the documents she had stolen, understanding for the first time the full scope of Whitmore's crimes. She learned names and connections she had not known before. She learned that the conspiracy was larger than she had imagined, reaching into the highest levels of South Carolina society. In April of 1861, the war finally came. Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the bloodiest conflict in American history began. The country was torn apart, and in the chaos new opportunities emerged. Mrs. Cole's contacts in the North began to move the documents through secret channels. The information was passed from hand to hand, making its way toward abolitionists and journalists and federal officials who would know what to do with it. But Essie was not content to wait for others to act. She had spent 18 months as a prisoner, 18 months as a specimen, 18 months being studied and measured and cut open. She had promised herself that she would make them pay, and now she was ready to keep that promise. She began to move through the plantations around Charleston, traveling at night, using the strength that had once been her curse as the tool of liberation. She found enslaved people who needed help escaping. She broke chains with her bare hands. She tore doors off their hinges. She carried children who were too tired to walk. She became a legend among the enslaved population, a whispered story about a girl who was stronger than any man, who appeared out of the darkness to set people free. They called her the Shadow. By the summer of 1861, the Shadow had helped more than 40 enslaved people escape to Union lines. She had disrupted operations at a dozen plantations, costing their owners thousands of dollars in lost property and damaged infrastructure. She had become one of the most wanted fugitives in South Carolina. And she was just getting started. The documents she had stolen from Whitmore began to have their effect in the fall of 1861. Stories appeared in northern newspapers about illegal slave trading in Charleston. Names were named. Evidence was presented. The respectable men who had attended Whitmore's exhibitions, who had discussed breeding Essie like livestock, who had profited from the illegal importation of human beings, found their reputations under attack. Some of them denied everything. Some of them fled to other states or other countries. Some of them found themselves facing criminal charges that would haunt them for years. Dr. Theodore Simmons, the professor who had suggested breeding Essie, was dismissed from the Medical College of South Carolina amid scandal and disgrace. James Crawford, the planter who had wanted to use her as a work animal, lost half his fortune when his illegal trading activities were exposed and his credit was destroyed. Senator Robert Tillman was forced to withdraw from public life. When letters praising Whitmore's scientific work were published in newspapers across the country, one by one, the men who had participated in Essie's torment found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. Not all of them were brought to justice. Many escaped punishment entirely, protected by their wealth and their connections, but their names were known now. Their crimes were documented. The measure that Essie had taken of them was being used against them. And through it all, Whitmore himself remained at large. His reputation was damaged. His business was disrupted. But he had not been captured. He had not been tried. He had not paid the full price for what he had done. Essie knew that her work was not finished. She knew that sooner or later she would have to face Whitmore again. She knew that the final reckoning was still to come, but that reckoning would have to wait. The war was intensifying. The Union Army was pushing deeper into Confederate territory. New opportunities were emerging for enslaved people throughout the South. Essie threw herself into the work of liberation, using her strength and her knowledge to help as many people as possible escape to freedom. She was 17 years old when she escaped from Whitmore's basement. By the time the war ended 4 years later, she would be 21, and in those 4 years, she would become one of the most effective and feared liberators the South had ever seen. But that is a story for another time. The summer of 1861 was the bloodiest summer South Carolina had ever seen, and it was only the beginning. The war between the Union and the Confederacy was spreading across the country like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Battles were being fought in Virginia, in Missouri, in the waters off the coast. Young men were dying by the thousands, and everyone knew that the worst was yet to come. For Essie, the war was not an abstraction. It was an opportunity. She had spent the months since her escape building a network of contacts throughout the low country of South Carolina. Free black people who hated slavery. Enslaved people who were willing to risk everything for freedom. White abolitionists who had come south before the war and now found themselves trapped behind enemy lines. Even a few Confederate deserters who had seen enough of the war to know that the cause they were fighting for was not worth dying for. These people became her eyes and ears. They told her which plantations were vulnerable, which overseers were cruel, which enslaved people were ready to run. They provided safe houses where runaways could hide during the day and routes that could be traveled at night. They created a web of resistance that stretched from Charleston to the Georgia border. Invisible to the Confederate authorities, but humming with activity. And at the center of that web was the shadow. The stories about her grew with each passing month. Some said she could lift a horse over her head. Some said she had once torn down an iron gate with her bare hands. Some said she could not be killed, that bullets bounced off her skin, that she had been touched by God or the devil or the spirits of her ancestors. The stories were exaggerated, of course. Essie was strong, but she was not invincible. She bled when she was cut. She felt pain when she was hurt. She was human, like everyone else. But she understood the power of legend. She understood that fear could be a weapon as effective as any rifle. So she let the stories spread. She even encouraged them, leaving signs of her presence at plantations she had raided, breaking things that should have been unbreakable, doing things that seemed impossible. The slaveholders of South Carolina were terrified. They hired extra guards. They reinforced their locks. They kept their enslaved people under constant surveillance. But none of it mattered. The shadow came anyway, appearing out of the darkness, disappearing before anyone could stop her. By the end of 1861, Essie had helped more than 100 enslaved people escape. Some of them made their way to Union lines, and eventually to freedom in the North. Others joined the growing communities of runaways, hiding in the swamps and forests of the low country, surviving off the land and waiting for the day when the Union Army would arrive to liberate them all. But Essie's activities had not gone unnoticed by the Confederate authorities. They knew someone was organizing the escapes, someone with unusual abilities and extensive knowledge of the region. They did not know who she was or where she came from, but they were determined to find out. In January of 1862, the Confederate military commander in Charleston issued a warrant for the capture of the individual known as the Shadow. A reward of $500 was offered for information leading to her arrest. Slave patrols were increased throughout the Low Country. Every black person, free or enslaved, was viewed with suspicion. The crackdown made Essie's work more dangerous, but it did not stop her. She simply became more careful, more cunning, more ruthless. She changed her routes. She varied her patterns. She trusted fewer people with information about her movements. She became a ghost. Impossible to predict, impossible to catch. And she continued to wait for news of Silas Whitmore. The doctor had disappeared after Essie's escape. His mansion on Meeting Street had been closed up, his laboratory abandoned. Some said he had fled to Europe to escape the scandal caused by the leaked documents. Others said he had gone to Richmond, the new capital of the Confederacy, to offer his services to the rebel government. No one knew for certain where he was or what he was doing. But Essie knew he was still alive. She could feel it in her bones, a certainty that went beyond reason. Their story was not finished. Sooner or later, they would meet again. That meeting came sooner than she expected. In March of 1862, Essie received word from one of her contacts in Charleston. Dr. Silas Whitmore had returned to the city. He was not practicing medicine anymore. He was not conducting experiments. He was working for the Confederate Army, using his knowledge of the slave trade to help the government acquire laborers for military construction projects. The Confederacy needed workers to build fortifications, dig trenches, maintain supply lines. Free labor was expensive and hard to find. Enslaved labor was abundant and cost nothing beyond the expense of keeping the workers alive. Whitmore had become a broker, connecting plantation owners with military contracts, taking a percentage of every transaction. He was making more money than ever. And he was doing it on the backs of enslaved people, just as he always had. When Essie heard this news, something shifted inside her. The patient, methodical approach she had adopted since her escape gave way to something hotter, something more urgent. She had spent a year waiting, planning, building her network. Now it was time to act. She began to gather intelligence on Whitmore's new operation. She learned that he had set up an office in a warehouse near the Charleston docks, where enslaved workers were processed before being sent to military construction sites. She learned that he had hired a small army of guards to protect himself, men who were paid well to ask no questions and show no mercy. She learned that he kept detailed records of every transaction, records that would be damning if they fell into the wrong hands. She also learned something else, something that made her blood run cold. Whitmore was looking for her. He had not forgotten what she had done to him. He had not forgotten the documents she had stolen, the message she had written on his wall, the humiliation she had caused him. He was offering a personal reward of $1,000 for her capture, separate from the official Confederate bounty. He wanted her back. He wanted to finish what he had started. When Essie heard this, she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Good," she said to Mrs. Cole, who had brought her the news. "Let him look. Let him spend his money and his time hunting for me. It'll make it easier when I come for him." Mrs. Cole looked at her with worried eyes. "Child, you need to be careful. This man is dangerous. He has resources, connections. If he finds you, he won't find me," Essie said. "I'll find him first." She began to plan her attack. It took her 3 months to prepare. She gathered information, recruited allies, scouted locations, mapped escape routes. She studied Whitmore's habits, learned his schedule, identified the weaknesses in his security. She was patient, methodical, thorough. She would have one chance to bring him down. She could not afford to fail. On the night of June 15, 1862, Essie made her move. The warehouse, where Whitmore conducted his business, was a large brick building on the waterfront, surrounded by a high fence topped with iron spikes. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter at all hours. The only entrance was a heavy wooden gate that was kept locked and watched. Essie did not go through the gate. She approached the warehouse from the waterside, swimming through the dark harbor, until she reached the pilings that supported the building's foundation. She climbed up the pilings hand over hand, her extraordinary strength making the ascent easy. She found a loose board in the floor above and pried it open, slipping into the warehouse through a gap barely wide enough for a normal person. The interior of the warehouse was dark and cavernous. Crates and barrels were stacked along the walls. In the center of the space was an open area where enslaved people were held before being transported to their work assignments. It was empty now, the workers having been moved out earlier that day. Essie moved through the shadows, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She could hear voices coming from a room at the back of the warehouse. Whitmore's office. She crept toward it, staying low, using the stacked cargo as cover. The door to the office was open a crack. Lamplight spilled through the gap, casting a thin line of gold across the floor. Essie pressed herself against the wall and listened. She could hear Whitmore's voice, that cold, precise voice that had haunted her dreams for more than 2 years. He was talking to someone, discussing numbers, prices, delivery schedules. Business as usual. The business of human suffering. The army needs 300 more workers by the end of the month. Whitmore was saying, "I've already secured commitments from planters in Beaufort and Georgetown. We should be able to meet the quota with room to spare." "And the payment?" Another voice asked. $40 per head per month, same as before. The planters are happy to rent out their slaves for that price. It's pure profit for them, and we take our cut off the top. Essie felt her hands clench into fists. $40 a head. That was what a human life was worth to these men. $40 a month, paid to someone who had never done a day's work in their life, while the actual workers labored and suffered and died. She had heard enough. Essie pushed open the door and stepped into the office. Whitmore was sitting behind a large wooden desk, papers spread before him, a pen in his hand. Across from him sat a Confederate officer in a gray uniform, a major, by his insignia. Both men looked up when the door opened, their expressions shifting from surprise to confusion to fear as they recognized who had just walked in. "You," Whitmore breathed. His face had gone pale. His hand trembled as he set down his pen. "Me," Essie said. Her voice was calm, steady. "Did you miss me, Doctor?" The Confederate officer reached for the pistol at his belt. He never made it. Essie crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed his wrist. Squeezing until she felt the bones grind together, the officer cried out in pain and dropped the weapon. Essie picked it up and tucked it into her waistband. "Don't," she said to Whitmore, who had started to rise from his chair. "Sit down. We're going to have a conversation." Whitmore sat. His face was a mask of barely controlled terror. "The guards," he said. "They'll have heard." "Your guards are busy right now," Essie said. "I have friends outside who are keeping them occupied. We won't be disturbed." She walked around the desk until she was standing directly in front of Whitmore, close enough to touch him. He flinched back in his chair, pressing himself against the leather, as if he could somehow escape through it. "Do you remember what you did to me?" Essie asked quietly. "Do you remember the cage? The experiments, the surgeries?" Whitmore's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "I remember everything," Essie continued. "Every cut, every measurement. Every time you talked about me like I was an animal, a thing, a specimen to be studied. I remember the people you invited to watch. I remember their names. I remember what they said." She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "I remember you telling them that you wanted to find out what made me strong. You wanted to understand the source of my power. You cut me open trying to find it." She reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt, lifting him out of his chair with one hand. Whitmore dangled in the air, his feet kicking helplessly, his face turning red as the collar tightened around his throat. "Do you want to know the source of my strength, Doctor? Do you want to understand it?" She brought him close, so close that their noses were almost touching. "It comes from everyone you ever hurt, everyone you ever sold, everyone you ever cut open and studied and threw away like garbage. Their strength flows through me. Their pain fuels me. And there is nothing in your science, nothing in your books, nothing in your cold, dead heart that can measure that." She threw him across the room. He hit the wall hard and crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. The Confederate officer had been watching all of this with wide eyes. He had not moved since Essie took his gun. Now he raised his hands in surrender. "Please," he said. "I'm just a soldier. I was just following orders." "I don't." "I know exactly what you are," Essie said. "You're a man who profits from slavery, same as him. You think wearing a uniform makes you different. It doesn't. You're all the same." She turned back to Whitmore, who was slowly pulling himself up against the wall. "I'm not going to kill you," she said. "I thought about it for 2 years. I thought about how good it would feel to break your neck with my bare hands. But that would be too easy. That would let you escape." She walked to his desk and gathered the papers that were spread across it. Financial records, shipping manifests, letters from military officials and plantation owners, evidence of corruption and illegal activity that reached into the highest levels of the Confederacy. "Instead, I'm going to destroy you," she said. "I'm going to take these papers and give them to people who will make sure the whole world knows what you've done. Not just the slave trading, not just the experiments, everything, every crime, every secret, every deal you ever made." She stuffed the papers into a satchel she had brought with her. Your name is going to become a curse. People will spit when they say it. Your family will be ashamed to admit they knew you. And you're going to live long enough to see it all happen. That's your punishment. That's your sentence. Whitmore had managed to get to his feet, leaning against the wall for support. There was blood on his lip where he had bitten it during the fall. His eyes were wild, desperate. You can't do this, he said. You're just a slave. You're nothing. You're property. Issy walked toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back. I was never property, she said. I was never nothing. You just couldn't see it, because you were too blind, too stupid, too convinced of your own superiority to recognize the human being standing right in front of you. She opened the door. Goodbye, doctor. I hope you live a very long time. She walked out of the office and disappeared into the darkness of the warehouse. Behind her, she could hear Whitmore screaming for his guards, screaming for help, screaming threats and promises and pleas. But no one came. Her allies outside had done their work well. By the time the guards finally responded, Essie was long gone. She had slipped back into the harbor, swam to a waiting boat, and vanished into the night. The papers she had taken would be on their way to Union lines within the week. The destruction of Silas Whitmore had begun. Over the months that followed, the documents Essie had stolen made their way through the network of abolitionist and Union sympathizers that stretched from the south to the north. They were copied, analyzed, and disseminated to newspapers, government officials, and military commanders. The revelations were devastating. Whitmore's records showed that he had been involved in the illegal importation of enslaved Africans for more than 15 years. They showed that he had bribed customs officials, harbor masters, and law enforcement officers to look the other way. They showed that he had connections to some of the most prominent families in South Carolina. People who had publicly denounced the illegal slave trade while secretly profiting from it. The records also revealed the extent of Whitmore's medical experiments. Detailed notes described the procedures he had performed on dozens of enslaved people over the years. Names, dates, outcomes. People who had been cut open, studied, and discarded like laboratory specimens. People who had died in agony so that Whitmore could satisfy his twisted curiosity about racial differences. When these revelations became public, the reaction was swift and severe. In the North, abolitionists held up Whitmore's records as proof of the horrors of slavery. Newspapers published excerpts from his notes, describing his experiments in graphic detail. Politicians cited his activities as justification for the war, arguing that the Confederacy was a criminal enterprise that needed to be destroyed. In the South, the response was more complicated. Some Confederate leaders tried to distance themselves from Whitmore, claiming that his activities were isolated and did not represent the character of the slaveholding class. Others defended him, arguing that his work was legitimate scientific research that had been misrepresented by Northern propagandists. But the damage was done. Whitmore's reputation was destroyed. His business collapsed. His allies abandoned him. The Confederate government, embarrassed by the scandal, stripped him of his military contracts and barred him from working with the army. By the end of 1862, Silas Whitmore was a ruined man. He had lost his wealth, his position, his standing in society. He was a pariah, shunned by everyone who had once courted his favor. He retreated to his mansion on Meeting Street and rarely emerged, hiding from the world he had once dominated. But Essie was not finished with him yet. The war continued through 1863 and into 1864. Union forces tightened their grip on the Confederacy, capturing key cities and severing supply lines. In South Carolina, federal troops had established a foothold on the Sea Islands off the coast, liberating thousands of enslaved people and establishing communities of freed people who worked the land for themselves. Essie became part of this effort. She worked with Union commanders, providing intelligence about Confederate positions and helping to guide raiding parties through territory she knew better than anyone. Her knowledge of the Low Country was invaluable, and her reputation as the shadow opened doors that would have been closed to anyone else. She also continued her work liberating enslaved people from plantations throughout the region. With Union support, she was able to operate more openly, leading large groups of runaways to safety rather than moving in small numbers under cover of darkness. By the end of 1864, she had helped more than 500 people escape to freedom. The men who had participated in her torture at Whitmore's exhibitions continued to face consequences. Dr. Theodore Simmons, the professor who had suggested breeding her, was arrested by Union forces when they captured Charleston and was charged with crimes against humanity. He died in federal custody before he could be tried. A broken and disgraced man. James Crawford, the planter, who had wanted to use her as a work animal, lost everything when Union troops burned his plantation to the ground. He fled to Texas and was never heard from again. Senator Robert Tillman, the politician who had praised Whitmore's work, was captured by Union soldiers in 1865 and spent the rest of the war in a prison camp in New York. After the war, he was barred from holding public office and died in obscurity in 1871. One by one, the men who had hurt Essie paid the price for their crimes. Not all of them faced justice. Some escaped, protected by their wealth or their connections or simple luck. But enough of them fell that Essie felt a grim satisfaction. The measure she had taken of them was being used against them. The ledger was being balanced. And then came the end of the war. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. 4 million people were free. When news of the surrender reached South Carolina, Essie was with a group of freed people on one of the Sea Islands. They gathered on the beach and watched the sun set over the water, singing songs of praise and thanksgiving. They had survived. They had won. The nightmare was finally over. But for Essie there was one more task to complete. One more account to settle. On April 18, 1865, Union forces entered Charleston. The city that had been the cradle of secession, the heart of the Confederacy, fell without a fight. Confederate soldiers had already fled, leaving behind a population of civilians and freed people to greet the conquering army. Essie was among the first to enter the city. She walked through streets she had once traveled in fear, past buildings where she had hidden from slave patrols, through neighborhoods where she had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The city was different now. The old order was crumbling. A new world was being born. She made her way to Meeting Street, to the mansion where she had been held prisoner, where she had been tortured and studied and treated like an animal. The building was still standing, but it showed signs of neglect. Windows were broken. The garden was overgrown. The paint was peeling from the walls. She walked up to the front door and pushed it open. It was not locked. Inside, the mansion was dark and silent. Dust covered every surface. The furniture was shrouded with white sheets. The paintings on the walls had been removed, leaving rectangular patches of lighter wallpaper where they had hung. Essie moved through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. She descended the stairs to the basement, then to the sub-basement. The place that had been her prison, the place that had defined her life. The heavy wooden door was still there, reinforced with iron bands. It stood open. She walked into the laboratory. It was exactly as she remembered it. The shelves of jars and instruments. The table with its iron shackles. The row of cages along the wall. Everything was covered with dust, but nothing had been moved. It was like stepping into a tomb. And there, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, was Dr. Silas Whitmore. He was older than she remembered. His hair had gone completely white. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken. He was dressed in a stained shirt and trousers that hung loosely on his wasted frame. He looked like a man who had been slowly dying for years. He looked up when Essie entered. For a moment, there was no recognition in his eyes. Then he saw her face, and something flickered to life in those dead eyes. Something like fear. "You came," he said. His voice was a whisper, barely audible. "I knew you would. I've been waiting." Essie stood in the doorway, looking at the man who had caused her so much suffering. She had imagined this moment many times. She had rehearsed what she would say, what she would do. She had dreamed of breaking him, of making him feel a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on her and so many others. But now that she was here, she felt nothing. No rage, no hatred, not even satisfaction. Just a profound emptiness, like staring into a hole where something had once been. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "You could have fled. Everyone else did." Whitmore laughed. A hollow sound that echoed in the empty laboratory. "Where would I go? My money is gone. My reputation is destroyed. No one will help me. No one will even speak to me. I have nothing left." He gestured weakly at the room around them. "This is all I have. This laboratory. These instruments. The work I did here. It's the only thing that ever mattered to me. The only thing that made me feel alive." He looked at Essie with something like curiosity. "I've thought about you every day since you escaped. I've wondered how you did it. How you bent those bars, how you survived. I thought I understood what you were. But I was wrong. I never understood anything." Essie walked slowly toward him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to touch him, close enough to kill him with a single blow. "You wanted to know where my strength came from," she said. "You cut me open trying to find it. You studied me like I was a specimen. But you never found anything, did you? Because you were looking in the wrong place." She crouched down so that she was at eye level with him. "My strength doesn't come from my muscles or my bones or my blood. It comes from here." She placed her hand over her heart. "It comes from everyone who ever loved me. My mother, who died bringing me into this world. My father, who was ripped away from me when I was 3 years old. The people who raised me and protected me and taught me how to survive. The people I've helped escape to freedom. The people who believed in me when I had nothing left to believe in." She stood up. "That's what you could never understand. That's what all your science and all your experiments could never measure. We're not animals. We're not specimens. We're human beings. And the strength that comes from that, from love and hope and the refusal to be broken, is greater than anything you can imagine." Whitmore stared at her for a long moment. Then he bowed his head. "I know," he said quietly. "I know that now. I've had a long time to think about it, about what I did, about who I was, about the monster I became." He looked up at her again. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for mercy. I know what I deserve. I'm just asking you to understand that I know. I finally understand." Essie was silent. She had not expected this. She had expected defiance or fear or denial. Not this quiet acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Not this broken confession from a broken man. "It doesn't change anything," she said finally. "It doesn't bring back the people you killed. It doesn't heal the wounds you inflicted. It doesn't undo the suffering you caused. I know, Whitmore said. Nothing can change that. Nothing can make it right. I just wanted you to know, before the end, that I understand now, that I see what I was, that I'm sorry. Issy looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything he had done, not just to her, but to dozens of other people. She thought about the lives he had destroyed, the families he had torn apart, the pain he had inflicted in the name of science. She thought about what he deserved. And then she made her decision. I'm not going to kill you, she said. I could. It would be easy. But that would make me like you. It would make me a monster, and I refuse to be a monster. She turned toward the door. The Union Army is in the city. They'll be looking for war criminals, men who participated in atrocities. Men like you. I'm going to tell them where to find you. What happens after that is up to them. She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. I hope you live a long time, Doctor. I hope you have years and years to think about what you did. I hope you remember the faces of everyone you hurt. I hope they haunt you until the day you die. As she walked out of the laboratory and did not look back. 3 days later, Union soldiers arrested Silas Whitmore at his mansion on Meeting Street. He was charged with crimes against humanity and transported to a federal prison in New York to await trial. He never made it to the courtroom. On August 12, 1865, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was heart failure. But those who saw the body said, he looked like a man who had simply stopped wanting to live. When Essie heard the news, she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just the same emptiness she had felt when she confronted him in his laboratory. It was over. The monster was dead. But the world he had helped create was still there, still broken, still in need of healing. She turned her attention to that work. In the years following the war, Essie became a leader in the community of freed people in South Carolina. She helped establish schools where former slaves could learn to read and write. She organized workers to demand fair wages and decent conditions. She advocated for the political rights of black citizens during the turbulent years of Reconstruction. She also continued to fight against the men who tried to restore the old order. When the Ku Klux Klan emerged in South Carolina, terrorizing black communities and murdering those who dared to assert their rights, Essie was among the first to stand against them. She used her strength and her reputation to protect the vulnerable, to confront the violent, to make it clear that the freed people of South Carolina would not be intimidated. The stories about her continued to grow. People said she had once fought off a dozen Klansmen single-handed. They said she had torn down a burning cross with her bare hands. They said she had faced down armed mobs without flinching. Some of these stories were true. Some were exaggerated. But all of them served a purpose. They reminded people that they were not powerless, that they could fight back. That strength came from community, from solidarity, from the refusal to be broken. In 1870, Essie married a man named Daniel Freeman, a former soldier in the United States Colored Troops who had fought at the Battle of Honey Hill and the Siege of Charleston. Together, they had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Essie named her first daughter Cora, after the mother she had never known. She told her children the stories of her life. The plantation where she was born, the strength that had made her different, the doctor who had tried to break her, the years she had spent fighting for freedom. She told them so that they would understand where they came from, so that they would know what their mother had survived, so that they would carry her strength with them into the future. The years of Reconstruction gave way to the years of redemption. as white Southerners reclaimed political power and began the long process of stripping away the rights that black people had won. Jim Crow laws were passed. Segregation was enforced. The promise of freedom was betrayed again and again by a nation that could not bring itself to treat all its citizens as equals. Essie watched these developments with sorrow, but not surprise. She had never believed that freedom would come easily. She had never expected that the victory of the war would be the end of the struggle. She knew that the fight for justice was not a single battle, but a long campaign, one that would continue for generations. She did what she could. She organized, she advocated, she refused to be silent. And when she could no longer fight, she passed the torch to her children and her grandchildren, trusting them to continue the work she had begun. Essie died on September 8, 1912, exactly 53 years after the day she had lifted a wagon off a trapped horse and changed her life forever. She was 70 years old. She was surrounded by her family. 3 generations of free people who owed their existence to a girl who had refused to be measured, studied, or broken. Her last words, according to her granddaughter, were, "The strength is in you. Never forget." And they never did. The story of Essie Freeman was passed down through her family for generations. It was told at kitchen tables and church gatherings, at family reunions and memorial services. It was a story of suffering and survival, of cruelty and resistance, of the darkness that human beings can inflict on one another, and the light that can survive even in the deepest darkness. It was also a story that the official histories tried to forget. The men who had participated in Whitmore's experiments, the institutions that had sanctioned his work, the system that had made his crimes possible. None of them wanted to remember what they had done. They buried the evidence. They destroyed the records. They told themselves that it had never happened, or that it had not been as bad as people said, or that it had been necessary for the advancement of science. But the truth has a way of surviving. It lives in the memories of those who experienced it. It echoes in the stories that are passed from generation to generation. It waits patiently for the day when someone will finally listen. This is that story. The story of a girl who was born into slavery, who was blessed and cursed with extraordinary strength, who was sold to a monster and subjected to horrors that no human being should ever have to endure. The story of how she escaped, how she fought back, how she brought down the men who had tried to destroy her. The story of how she lived her life as a free woman, raising a family, building a community, fighting for justice until the day she died. It is a story about the darkness of the human heart, the capacity for cruelty that exists in all of us, but it is also a story about something else, something stronger than cruelty, something that cannot be measured or studied or explained by science, the strength that comes from love, the power that comes from community, the resilience that comes from refusing, absolutely and unconditionally, to be broken. Essie Freeman had that strength. She carried it with her from the plantation, where she was born, to the laboratory, where she was tortured, to the battlefields of the Civil War, to the communities she helped build in the years that followed. She passed it on to her children and her grandchildren and all the generations that came after. And it is still there today, in everyone who fights for justice, who stands against oppression, who refuses to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. The shadow is gone, but her strength remains. It flows through history like an underground river, invisible but unstoppable, waiting for the moments when it is needed most. This is Essie's legacy, not the scars on her hands or the stories in the newspapers or the documents that brought down her tormentors. Her legacy is the strength itself, the unbreakable thing that lives in the hearts of all who refuse to be measured, studied, or defined by the people who would destroy them. The strength that cannot be explained. The power that cannot be contained. The light that burns in the darkness, no matter how deep. That is what S.E. Freeman left behind